Thank you, Daniel, for being here, man. It's really an honor and a privilege.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Um, yeah, let's not waste any time and just I'm gonna use the hour that we blocked as efficiently as possible to pick your brain and talk about your latest book, The Power of Regret. But first, let's build some connection between you and the audience. What is the most important thing you should have done this year but didn't?
The most important thing I should have done this year and didn't was probably get started on some new kind of daunting big projects that I've been meaning to do, but never got around to it. So it's a classic case of I think of the urgent pushing aside the important. So in a given moment, oh man, I just need to respond to these 7 emails. But so doing that instead of getting some traction on bigger, longer term projects.
Yeah. I experienced that a lot in the process of writing a book. I mean, if I don't block myself off, then there's always something that just interrupts the process.
Absolutely right. That's how it is. I think that's how it is for most people, but certainly how it is for me.
And looking back, is it a regret? Do you regret it?
Sort of. Yeah, sort of. I mean, in a sense that it's because of you confined it to this year. I'm not sure it's a fully blossomed regret yet because it's still pretty fresh. But if it were to go on for a long time, it would definitely grow into a big regret.
Okay. What's your biggest regret of all time?
I don't know if I have a biggest regret. I have a lot of regrets. I have regrets about kindness, especially when I was younger. When regrets about not about bullying people, because I didn't do that, but being in situations where people were being mistreated, where people were not being dealt with fairly, where they were being excluded, and seeing that, knowing it was wrong, and not doing anything about it. That bugs me to this day.
Yeah, I reading your book and reflecting on my regrets, I had a similar insight that I do regret the way I treated some people at high school.
Yeah.
And I mean, driven by insecurity, you become.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Mine, I mean, I mean, I guess mine was driven in part by insecurity, but mine was more of a kind of a passive harm rather than an active harm. And I think it was because I was too scared to stand up for myself or too scared to stand up for other people.
But do you know the book, The 5 Regrets of the Dying?
I do know that book.
Yeah, it's one, if not my favorite book of all times in terms of the impact it had, because I read it in a time where I was very close to someone who was dying. And I have the 5 regrets of the dying there on a poster on the wall to remind me every day.
Wow.
Yeah, and looking at your book, I saw some comparisons in the types of regrets that came out of the story of the 5 regrets of the dying and your book, and we're gonna dig into that into a moment. But first, can you explain my audience what regret is?
Yeah, regret is an emotion. It's an emotion that makes us feel bad. It's an emotion that makes us feel bad when we look backward and wish we had done something that we didn't do, wish we hadn't done something that we did do, wish we had done things in a different way. And it's a negative feeling today about something that we did yesterday.
And do you remember the moment that you had the idea to write a book about it?
Well, sort of. I was at my elder daughter's university graduation a few years ago, and there's a lot of waiting around. And as I was at this graduation, thinking about her, thinking about the incredibly quick passage of time, I started thinking about my own university experience, and my thoughts immediately turned to my regrets about that university experience, even though I was generally pretty happy. I wish I had taken more risks. I wish I had worked harder. I wish I had been kinder. And something strange happened. Like, I never really thought a lot about my regrets. I mean, I had them, but I never really talked about them because I knew that nobody wanted to talk about regret. And I came back and I started talking to a few people about my regrets, and I found out that everybody wanted to talk about regrets. That as soon as I started talking about my own, everybody wanted to talk about theirs. And for a writer, that's a very, very interesting reaction. And so I actually ended up putting aside one book that I was working on and started doing some preliminary research on this topic of regret, and then spent a couple of months writing an entirely new book proposal, and put aside that one book and got into this other book.
Okay. Yeah, there's quite a lot of content on fear and on love, definitely, in terms of emotions. There's not that much written about regret.
No,
right?
No, there's not that much written in the popular audience. And some of the stuff that's written is it's not really research based. It's just sort of people's thoughts and impressions, which is okay, but doesn't give you, I think, the full picture of it. That's the bad news. The good news is that there is an enormous amount of academic research on this emotion. So this is an emotion this is a phenomenon that economists began studying during the Cold War. It's an emotion that social psychologists began studying about how it plays out in our everyday lives, how it plays out in environments and contexts. It's an emotion that developmental psychologists have studied for a very long time to figure out how it emerges in our development of our thinking and our feeling. It's an emotion that neuroscientists have studied. It's an emotion that cognitive scientists have studied. So even though there's not a lot of good stuff written for a popular audience, there's a very, very rich foundation of research that one can draw from, which is what I tried to do in this book.
Yeah. And so it must be there for a reason. I mean, after millions of years of evolution, there must be a reason why we have regret. Did you? I mean, I obviously read your book, so I know you found the reason, but maybe can you quickly summarize it for
Nick,
us?
this is actually a really important point. Okay, and what we have to understand is that regret. There are two things that seem to be contradictory. One of them is that regret is one of the most common emotions that human beings experience. We know from these different bodies of science that we know from social psychology, for instance, it's one of the most common emotions that human beings experience. It's arguably the most common negative emotion that human beings experience. All right, so we know that. We know that from developmental psychologists that it is a part of our cognitive development. That is, little kids can't experience regret because their brains haven't developed the dexterity or the sophistication to do the kind of time travel that I was just suggesting, where you go back in time and then forward in time. But we know from neuroscience that certain people cannot experience regret, and the reason they can't experience regret is they literally have physiological problems with their brain, lesions in a certain part of the brain called the orbital frontal cortex, certain kinds of Huntington's disease, certain kinds of Parkinson's disease. And so exactly as you say, it's part of our cognitive machinery. Now, here's the thing. Regret feels terrible. I don't like experiencing regret. You asked me about my regrets and some of my regrets. I don't like them. It doesn't make me feel good. And so so your question that you're posing, Nick, is the central question. Why would something so unpleasant be so ubiquitous? And the reason, and this is at the core of all of it, is because regret is useful if we treat it right. The problem is we haven't been treating it right. So especially here in America, we have this philosophy that a lot of people adhere to of no regrets. I never look backward. I always look forward. I'm never negative. I'm always positive. That is a bad idea. That is a unscientific recipe for living a good life. So ignoring our regrets is a bad idea, but also wallowing in our regrets, stewing in our regrets, getting captured by our regrets, that's really bad too. What we want to do is we want to confront our regrets, think about our regrets, use our regrets as signal, as information, as data. We want to think about our regrets. And when we do that, once again, we have evidence that it can be a powerful emotion. It can help us do better on a whole range of tasks. It can help us find greater meaning in life. It can help us think more clearly. So, the central kind of riddle here that you've identified is that we have this emotion that makes us feel bad, and yet it's widespread, and so it is there for a reason. And if we acknowledge that instead of denying it and actually take a new approach to our regrets, we can enlist this emotion to lead a better life.
Yeah, super fascinating. And my let's say area of focus and passion is the workplace, and therefore let's unravel how we could help people learn from their regrets within the context of the workplace. Do you see, by the way, is there a link between the fear for failure, which is very obvious in most of the organizations that I come in, and regrets? Is there a correlation between failure and regrets?
It's an interesting. Well, there's definitely So there's definitely a connection between those two things. Remember, though, failure is an action, right? Failing is something you do. All right. Regret is something that you feel. So we can experience regret because of our failures. Okay. So I think it's that connection. We can experience regret because of our failures, but it gets slightly complicated here for at least two reasons. First, how we respond to our failures is also in some ways how it gives us lessons on how to respond to regret, and vice versa. So we can take our failures. Let's say that we tried to start a business and it flopped. We can say, oh my God, I am the worst person in the world. I'm a complete moron. I should never be allowed to run a business ever again. Okay. That's typically a bad idea, sort of excoriating yourself, ripping yourself apart. It's generally a bad idea. We could also say, it doesn't matter. No regrets. My business went south, and that's a life, and I don't really care. I don't look backward. I always look forward. That's a bad idea too, because you're sacrificing the learning that can come from that. So what you want to do is you want to confront it, think about it, learn from it, extract a lesson from that. But when we look at the architecture of regret, this emotion that again, I studied looking at the 60 years of research, but also doing two large research projects of my own to try to uncover what this emotion is about. One of the interesting things about regret is that when we look at failures, the action that triggers the emotion, all right, most of the failures that people regret are not like the example that I just gave. They are failures of inaction rather than action. And it's overwhelming. The things that people are much more likely over time to regret what they didn't do rather than what they did do. So starting a business and having it flop, yeah, some people regret that. There's no question about that. But way more people regret the failure of never trying to start a business. And so there are some really interesting connections between the act of failure and the consequent emotion of regret.
Yeah, I'm thinking and grasping this. So probably people, as you say, regret is a negative emotion that comes when you either do or don't do something that failed. Probably consciously, more people link regret to a failure that they did and regretted it afterwards, which then gives them the fear to do something new.
Maybe, but some people, not always though. Let me stop you for a second. Not always, because the fear of doing something new is not always preceded by the fear of failure, by the experience of having failed at something. For many people, it's just they just don't take a shot. They don't take action. And it's not as if they're relative in my, okay, again, so let me take a step back here, Nick. So the question then becomes, how do you know? All right. How do you know? So how do you know what you're talking? How do I know what I'm talking about? Well, first of all, we have this 60 years of research that also shows that inactions are bigger regrets than actions. But what also happened is I did 2 other pieces of research. One of them was the largest public opinion survey ever conducted of American attitudes about regret, where we found the same thing about action and inaction. And I also collected regrets from all over the world. We now have a database of over 23,000 regrets from 109 countries. And when you look at those, including, regrets all over the world, I mean, we probably have maybe 100 from Belgium. That's my guess. When we look at those regrets around the world, what you see is many, many, many more regrets about people never trying stuff than there are about people who tried stuff and failed. And so
the famous quote is right. You better regret something that you did do. Yeah, I paraphrase, but the phrase is that you better try something that you want to do and regret it afterwards than to regret it to never have done it in the first place.
I think there is some truth in that. Again, within certain kinds of boundaries. If you kill somebody or rob a bank, you're gonna, that's an action. You're probably gonna regret that. But what you see from people's real lived experience is what they regret. People do regret actions. They regret bullying people. They regret cheating on their spouse. They regret spending too much money. All right. So there are regrets of action, but the larger category of regrets are people who regret not asking somebody out on a date, not reaching out to an old friend, not starting a business, not traveling, not speaking up.
Is there a link between regret and trust? Trust in
what do you mean?
That if people have low self-esteem, low trust in themselves, that they interpret things that they do more often negatively, and as a result regret them.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, one of the things that you see in terms of excuse me, one of the things you see in terms of the healthy way to process regrets is, excuse me for 1 second, I just need to
go ahead.
One more time. I'm going to put myself on. Sorry about that.
Bless you.
So one of the things that you see when you in terms of the healthy way to deal with regrets is again, what we're trying to do here is not ignore our regrets and not wallow in our regrets, and not say it doesn't matter, and not say it's a worst thing that ever happened to me. All right, we want to take it down the center, and the way, and a really important way to deal with it, to deal with our regrets, is how we think about that regret and ourselves. And what happens, as you're suggesting, is that a lot of times when we make a mistake, when we fail, when we do something stupid or don't do something that we wanted to do, we beat ourselves up.
We're very harsh. Self-talk is crazy harsh.
Exactly. The self-talk, our self-talk is crazy harsh. All right. There is research on this, once again, and the research says don't do that. There's very little evidence that harsh self-talk is effective. It doesn't make you perform any better. What helps you perform better is something called self-compassion. Self-compassion is treating yourself with kindness rather than contempt. So you make a mistake, you have a regret. You don't say you're an idiot, you're the worst person in the world. You also don't say it doesn't matter. You say, wow, my regrets, a lot of people have regrets. Regrets are part of the human condition. I'm not that special. I'm going to treat myself with kindness rather than contempt. I'm going to treat myself with the same kindness I would treat somebody else who came to me with this regret. If a friend came to you with their regret, you wouldn't say, you idiot, you moron, what is wrong with you? Right? So if you don't do that to somebody else, don't do that to yourself. You don't have to treat yourself better than anybody else. The evidence doesn't say that. But the evidence doesn't say that it's effective to treat yourself worse than anybody else. What you should be doing is treating yourself with kindness rather than contempt, recognizing that your mistakes are part of the human condition, and also recognizing that any mistake, any screw up, any regret that you have is a moment in your life, not the full measure of your life. And once we do that, we can essentially open the way to begin making sense of our regret, drawing lessons from our regret, and then applying that lesson to future behavior.
Have you thought about how organizations, so within the context of the workplace, that we can help people learn from the regrets, maybe in the first place focused on the regrets they have regarding their professional career and the workplace?
There are all kinds of things that people can do. Let me give you an example. I'll give you a bunch of examples. So one thing that readers have told me, readers who've read this book and emailed me have told me, is that business readers is that they were dealing, like, let's say, I'm thinking of at least one example. So there's someone who runs a small operation, and he decided to share one of his regrets with his team, but instead of saying, just stopping there. Okay, you don't just stop there. You don't say, "Oh, I regret, not doing X or not doing or doing Y." You say, "Here's the regret that I have. Here's what I learned from it, and here's what I'm going to do about it." And that is one of the most powerful conversations you can have in the workplace. It's powerful because if you're a leader, you're signaling to people that you're not trying that your role model, you're offering yourself as a role model for how to deal with regrets effectively. You are giving them the psychological safety to express their own regrets. But also what you're doing is you're giving them a process, a mechanism to use it. So again, any of your listeners who are leading organizations or even leading small teams, share a regret that you have with your team, but don't stop there. Tell them what you learned from it, and tell them what you're going to do about it. And that's a very effective thing to do. There's another great idea. It comes from Tina Seelig at Stanford University, that she calls a failure resume, where everybody has a resume or a CV that has all of their accomplishments and accolades. This is the reverse of that, where you list your failures, your screw ups, your mistakes, but you don't stop there. You list, let's say, so one thing you can do to get started is list your 5 big failures or regrets imagine making like a table or a spreadsheet that's 5 by 3. Okay, so you list your 5 big regrets or failures on in one column, and then in the next column you list what lesson you learned from that. And in the third column, you list what action are you going to take to respond to that lesson. And this is the healthy way to deal with regret. You treat yourself with compassion, kindness rather than contempt. You explicitly make sense of your regret. You think of it as data, as information, right? You don't ignore it and you don't wallow in it. You confront it. And when we do that in the business world, Nick, we have piles of evidence, especially in social psychology, showing that if you deal with your regrets that way, it can help you become a better negotiator. If you deal with regrets that way, it can help you become a better strategist. If you deal with regrets that way, it can help you avoid cognitive biases. If you deal with regret that way, it can help you become a better problem solver. And so going back to the central riddle that you identified a few moments ago, regret exists for a reason, and we can use it. We have this tool, this ability that is, I think, largely unused. But if we recognize, hey, that feeling is there for a reason, and we respond to that feeling in a systematic way, regret is a transformative emotion.
Yeah, I think it's also the perfect time of the year. I'll try to release the conversation as soon as possible, so that people, instead of making New Year's intention that what's the date? Somewhere 16th January, most 80% of the people have left their New Year's resolutions or something. Better to look back.
Let me give your listeners an idea on that. All right. So here's an idea for New Year's resolutions. Before the new year, ask yourself the same question that you asked me, which is, what's a big regret you have this year? Something you did or something you didn't do. Then think about what lesson does that teach you? And then think about using that lesson. What should your New Year's resolution be? One of the things about New Year's resolutions is that we should have fewer rather than more. So have one New Year's resolution. I mean, people that have 17 New Year's resolutions might as well have 0 New Year's resolutions. So, but you can use your old year regrets to fashion your New Year's resolutions.
Yeah, I fully agree. Let me. So, I'm not going to try your one, the resume one, because I didn't know that one. But if you look at the 5 regrets of the dying, it's I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings, and I wish I had let myself be happier. And so, because this is here in my visual perspective, I regularly just evaluate myself on those 5 regrets. Like, am I living the life true to myself? Am I loving my work, but not that my work is burning me out? Am I staying in touch with friends? Do I express my feelings? Let myself be happier. So that's what I've done so far. But I like the resume thing trick. Okay. So in the book, you call this the inward, outward, forward technique, right?
Yes.
Yes. And in there, let me check my notes. There was 2 other techniques that I'd like to ask you something about. Could you give an example of what it means to talk to yourself in the 3rd person and why it's valuable?
So when we think about how do we make sense of our regrets, right? So what do? We treat ourselves with kindness rather than contempt. We disclose them and talk about them, largely because we want to convert this abstract negative emotion into concrete words. But then when it gets to the point of drawing a lesson from them, here's where that is helpful. In general, human beings are pretty good problem solvers, but we stink at solving our own problems because we're too close to it. So this is one reason why we do a better job of giving other people advice than giving ourselves advice. Because when we give ourselves advice, we're too close to the details. We're drowning in the details. So one thing that you can do to draw the lesson and try to find a path forward is not to ask yourself, in your case, not to ask yourself, what should I do? Ask yourself, what should Nick do? And talking to yourself in the 3rd person, there's some interesting research from Ethan Kross and others showing that gives you some distance. And so if you see yourself in part as another person, you're going to have the distance to get away from the gory details of the problem to a bigger picture of the problem.
Okay. Yeah. So some kind of internal role play.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it's called self-distancing. Self-distancing. You look at yourself like you would look at somebody else.
Okay. And then shortly also the technique of because it was also new to me. Phone call yourself in the future. So what do you do?
That's another kind of self-distancing. So what you can do is, and it really has to do with, in some ways, anticipating your future regrets. So but it's also a form of self-distancing as well. So, if you think about, let's say that one of the big regrets that I collected from the 23,000 regrets that we have in our database is a regret about not reaching out to someone who you care about. So you have a friend and you want to reach out and you don't reach out because you think it's going to be awkward, and then time passes and then you regret it. And so that ends up being one of the, as I said before, one of the big regrets that people have. One of the things that you can do is, if you're trying to make a decision, is ask yourself, let's say that I'm thinking about reaching out to an old friend this afternoon. and I'm not sure whether I should do it. What I can do is imagine talking to myself in 10 years. What does the me of 10 years from now want me to do? And it's pretty clear that the me of 10 years from now wants me to reach out. And that's another way to make a decision. This is a technique that Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, would use. Again, he had a self-distancing technique that I think is pretty effective, which is that when he was faced with a tough decision, he would ask himself, okay, if I were replaced tomorrow, what would my successor do? And he almost always knew.
Cool. That's maybe a good one to wrap up this cool conversation about regret. As you just mentioned, you analyzed the regrets of plus 20,000 people.
Right.
How has that changed your behavior? In your really, are there any examples that you can give and say, the insights that I retrieved from this process made me change this and this in my practical day-to-day behavior?
Sure.
Oh, you went to mute, Daniel.
Oh, sorry about that.
No
One of
worries.
the big regrets that I have, one of the big regrets that people have, one of the big 4 regrets that people have is if only I'd reached out. So they have relationships that were intact or should have been intact. The relationship comes apart, usually in slow, drifting kinds of ways. People want to reach out, they do not reach out, and then sometimes it's too late. So for me, having seen those thousands upon thousands of connection regrets, and I have those too. Now, if I'm at a juncture where I'm deciding, should I reach out or should I not reach out? I always reach out. So that's changed, and I never did that before. So that's changed my. That's one example of how it profoundly changed my behavior.
Yeah, and I guess also the feeling that it's so universal. It's again a confirmation of, that we are not alone in anything. That we look so much alike to each other, and there's so many things we don't talk about. And once you do, you just so easily build connection with people.
Absolutely. I mean, you're making 2 points there. One of them is the universality. One of them is like the ability to use that universality to connect with others. I think that first point of the universality is, again, one of the central takeaways from all of this research, which is that if I were to show you this database of regrets that I have around the world, I don't think you would be able to tell whether the regret came from Belgium. I mean, most of the regrets are in English. Okay, so I have plenty in Chinese and plenty in Spanish because we had the survey in those 2 languages as well.
Cool.
And some people around the world would submit it in their own native tongue, but the vast majority of these regrets are in English. So if I were to show you these, just randomly select a regret, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it came from Belgium or from the UK or from the United States or from Australia or from Japan. If it were written in English, there's no way. They're universal.
Okay. Well, I do not regret this conversation, first and foremost. And I really hope that it inspires a lot of people to really take a close look to their regrets for the benefit of themselves and their own relationships. So thank you so much for this conversation.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.